Warning. This video will take you on a terrifying, mysterious murder journey that will blow your mind and send chills down your spine, not just an ordinary murder story. If you're brave enough, watch the video until the end. Because the truths you're about to discover will shock you. Are you ready? Then let's begin. It was a cold November night in Amsterdam. The wind roamed the old streets of the city, blowing over the canals. The streets were quiet at this hour of the night, with only the distant sound of trams audible. As the city slept, no one knew what was about to happen nearby. The light from the street lamps reflected on the water of the canals. The old buildings had silently witnessed countless events over the centuries. This night would be no different. Emma van der Berg would breathe her last that night. The young woman's voice would be heard in Amsterdam's narrow streets, then it would be silenced forever. When morning came, the city would wake up, but nothing would ever be the same again. On a cold November evening, in an abandoned construction site in Amsterdam's Jordan district, construction worker Peter Jansen arrived to start work at the first light of dawn, unaware that he was about to encounter the most terrifying moment of his life. In the foggy air, a strange smell seeping from the concrete began to bother him. This metallic, sharp, unfamiliar smell was like the breath of death itself. Peter walked slowly toward the construction site. With each step, the stones and gravel beneath his feet crunched. No one else was around at this early hour, he could only hear his own footsteps. On the second floor, the walls were still unfinished, and morning light filtered through the gaps. That's when he noticed it, something bright and whitish at the base of the walls. The workers must have left something behind last night, he thought to himself. Maybe it was a bag of cement or a piece of painted wood. But his curiosity got the better of him, and he decided to take a closer look. However, with each step he took, a strange feeling grew inside him. His heartbeat quickened, and it became difficult to breathe. He didn't know why yet, but his body was signaling danger. There, on the cold concrete floor, lay 22-year-old Emma van der Berg. The young woman's hands were tied behind her back with thick plastic ties, her eyes covered with a black cloth. There were countless small cuts on her body, none of them fatal on their own, but together they created a horrific scene. Blood was slowly seeping from her body, forming a crimson pool around her. Her skin was ice-cold and pale, her lips blue. Peter's scream echoed horribly off the walls of the construction site. Feeling his hands tremble, he pulled out his phone and called emergency services. His voice was low and shaky, the words coming out with difficulty. He waited at a distance, afraid he would have to stay alone with the young woman's body until the police arrived. When Amsterdam Police Homicide Chief Inspector Henrik van Dijk was awakened by the phone call early that morning, he sensed this would not be a routine case. The 45-year-old veteran cop had encountered countless horrific scenes in his 20-year career, but even his first impressions at the scene deeply disturbed him. When he arrived at the scene, the forensic team had already begun their work. Dr. Marloes Visser, the forensic pathologist, examined the body, her expression growing increasingly serious. Her latex gloves were covered in blood as her eyes scanned Emma's body, searching for microscopic details. "This is very strange," Dr. Visser muttered, turning to Henrik. "The cuts are systematic and calculated. It's as if someone wanted to make her suffer slowly. But the strange thing is, none of these cuts alone should have caused this much blood loss." Henrik looked closer at the body. Emma's young face retained its beauty even under death's cold grip. Her auburn hair was scattered around her, and beneath the cloth covering her eyes, her eyelids were slightly swollen. This was a sign that she had been crying for a long time. "Did you identify her?" Henrik asked. Emma van der Berg, 25 years old. Photography student at the Amsterdam Academy of Art. "Her wallet is with her, nothing seems to be missing," replied his assistant, Detective Lars Decker. Lars was in his early 30s, a young but experienced police officer. With his blonde hair and blue eyes, he had the typical Dutch appearance, but the weight of his profession had created lines on his face at an early age. His perspective on this case was different from Henrik's, more analytical, more cold. "Has her family been notified?" Henrik asked, unable to take his eyes off the body. "Not yet. We need to examine this place thoroughly first. They may have deliberately staged this scene." Henrik began to survey his surroundings. Looking at the scene, he immediately sensed something was wrong. This was no ordinary crime scene. Everything was too orderly, too calculated. Emma's body lay right in the center, as if deliberately placed there. The pool of blood around her suggested that the young woman had been here for hours, slowly losing her life. Henrik's eyes fell on the walls. Metal pipes, steel rods, bricks. They all looked as if they had been thrown there randomly, but they hadn't. They formed a kind of composition. The killer had used this place as a stage. He hadn't just killed her, he had tried to turn her death into art. Henrik realized how much this disturbed him. He had never seen anything like it in his 20-year career. "It's a ritual," Henrik muttered, more to himself than anyone else. The killer didn't just want to make her suffer. He was doing something, trying to show something. The forensic team photographed every centimeter around the body, took blood samples, and searched for fingerprints. But the scene was strangely clean. It was as if the killer had carefully wiped away his traces, as if he were an expert at this. Dr. Visser was examining the cut on Emma's arm. "Look at this," he said, calling Henrik over. "These cuts are very precise. They were made with surgical precision. And look, here. On Emma's left wrist, there was a mark that was different from the other cuts. It wasn't deep, but it was very precise, as if it were a symbol." When Henrik looked closer, he realized it resembled a letter. "It looks like the letter V," said Lars, bending his head. "Or a downward-pointing arrow," added Dr. Visser. "This was done deliberately. The killer is trying to communicate with us." Henrik felt sick. Despite his 20 years of experience, he had never seen such a cold-blooded and systematic murder. Emma wasn't just a victim, she was part of a bigger game. Can you imagine what Peter, the worker who encountered this horrific scene, went through? What would you have done? Share your thoughts in the comments. Visiting Emma's family in the afternoon was always one of Henrik's most difficult tasks. The van der Berg family lived in one of Amsterdam's affluent neighborhoods. The house, built in traditional Dutch architecture, was a beautiful structure, narrow but tall, clad in brown bricks. Located on the edge of a canal, it appeared peaceful and warm from the outside. When Emma's mother, Ingrid van der Berg, opened the door and saw Henrik's police badge, her face paled. This elegant woman in her late 40s seemed to understand that something had happened to her daughter. Her father, Willem van der Berg, was a tall, calm man, a retired architect. When they heard the news, they clung to each other as if they were about to collapse. "Emma didn't come home last night," said Ingrid, her eyes filling with tears. "She always calls, tells us where she is. She's a very organized girl. I knew something was wrong." Willem put his hand on his wife's shoulder and asked Henrik, what had Emma been working on lately? Did she have any projects? "We need to look into that more, but we'll talk to her teachers and friends at the university," Henrik replied, as gently as possible. Ingrid took Henrik and Lars to Emma's room. The room reflected the creativity of a young artist. The walls were covered with photographs, views of Amsterdam streets, portraits, abstract compositions. Her latest photographs were on her desk. As Henrik examined them, something caught his attention. Many of the photos had been taken at night, showing the dark corners of Amsterdam. But among them were photos where people's faces were not clearly visible, featuring shadowy figures. These photos seemed to have been taken secretly. When were these photos taken? Henrik asked Ingrid. In the last few weeks. Emma was working on a project. She said it was a social project related to violence. For the university, I think. Lars began opening the drawers of the desk. Inside were notebooks, camera accessories, and various documents. But at the bottom of one drawer, he found a small notebook, as if hidden. When he opened the notebook, he saw notes written in Emma's handwriting. Written across the pages were various dates and places. Midnight Cafe, November 15th, Crimson Club, November 18th, night photos, could be dangerous, be careful. Henrik examined the notebook. It was clear that Emma had been exploring the dark corners of Amsterdam's nightlife in her final days. And these explorations had led to her death. What are the Midnight Cafe and the Crimson Club? He asked Willem. Willem frowned. I don't know. Emma didn't give us many details about her projects. Artists like to keep their work secret, don't they? As Henrik and Lars left the house, they knew they needed to do more research to understand what Emma had been pursuing in her final days. The nightclubs in her notebook could lead them to Emma's killer. By evening, Henrik was sitting at the police station reviewing Emma's file. He looked at the photos again, read the forensic report, and took notes on the witness statements. But there were missing pieces in his mind. Why had Emma gone to that construction site? Who had taken her there? And most importantly, why had the killer kept her alive for so long, making her suffer slowly? The initial autopsy report from Dr. Visser confirmed Henrik's thoughts. Emma had slowly bled to death over approximately 4 to 6 hours. The cuts had been meticulously made, avoiding vital organs. This indicated that the killer had medical knowledge or was very experienced. However, the most disturbing detail was the strange substance found in Emma's body. Traces of a sedative were found in her blood, but it wasn't strong enough to knock her out. The killer wanted to keep her conscious. Emma was aware of everything as she died. Henrik worked late into the night, trying to reconstruct Emma's last days. The writings in her notebook led them to Amsterdam's underworld. The Midnight Cafe and the Crimson Club were not well-known places in the city. These names perhaps pointed to the dark side of the nightlife. The next morning, Henrik and Lars went to the Amsterdam Academy of Art. Emma's teacher, Professor Dr. Saskia de Wit, was in her mid-40s and a renowned photographer in the art world. With her long black hair and sharp gaze, she had an intellectual air about her. Emma was a very talented student, said Professor de Wit, sitting in her office. She was very ambitious in her latest project. She was preparing a photo series on violence and social exclusion. What exactly did this project involve? Asked Henrik. Emma was photographing marginal groups in Amsterdam. Young people who frequented nightclubs, street artists, people pushed to the margins of society. Her goal was to tell their stories. Lars took out his notebook. Have you heard of these names before? Midnight Cafe, Crimson Club? Prof. De Wit's face changed. Crimson Club. Yes, I've heard that name. Emma mentioned it once. But it's not an official club. It's more of an underground community. What do you mean? Some young people in Amsterdam are interested in strange things. Vampire culture, gothic lifestyle, blood games. The Crimson Club could be one of those. Emma might have gone there to take photos. Henrik's skin prickled. The systematic cuts on Emma's body and the slow blood loss took on a terrifying meaning when combined with this information. The killer might be a member of this underground group. That evening, Henrik and Lars began investigating Amsterdam's nightlife. Finding out where the Crimson Club was wouldn't be easy. These kinds of places usually operated with secret addresses, spread by word of mouth. Finally, they got a tip from a familiar informant in the city. The Crimson Club met in the basement of an abandoned warehouse in Amsterdam's old industrial district. Only invited guests could enter, and these invitations were given based on very specific criteria. As Henrik pondered ways to infiltrate this group, he wondered how Emma had gained access. So, do you think Henrik and his team will dare to enter this mysterious club? What would you suggest at this point? Share your predictions in the comments. He couldn't understand how a young, innocent-looking art student could be involved in such a dark world. But the answers were close. Emma's death was just one of Amsterdam's dark secrets. And Henrik would do anything to uncover them. Amsterdam's cold winter night had enveloped the city in a thick blanket of fog. Henrik van Dyke and Lars Dekker were walking through the dark streets of the old industrial district. Abandoned factories, rusty cranes, and warehouses with broken windows stretched out around them. This area was filled with remnants of the city's forgotten past. They had spent hours searching for the Crimson Club's secret address. Finally, thanks to a tip from a drug dealer, they learned that the group gathered in the basement of an old maritime warehouse. However, getting in was no simple police raid. They didn't yet know how dangerous this group was. Henrik had studied Emma's photographs again, trying to understand the dark images she had taken in her final days. The photos showed people with faces hidden in shadows, strange symbols, and blood-red details. Emma, in her pursuit of art, had opened the door to a world that would lead to her death. When they arrived in front of the warehouse, Henrik felt a strange unease. From the outside, the building looked completely abandoned. Broken neon lights flickered, and the walls were covered in graffiti. But upon closer inspection, people were frequently coming and going around the building. This activity increased after midnight. "Let's keep watching," Henrik muttered. "We need to figure out how Emma got in here." Lars examined the building's entrance through his binoculars. There seems to be security at the door. And everyone who enters has to show something special. Some kind of membership card or invitation. Later that night, the sounds coming from the warehouse began to disturb Henrik. It wasn't music, more like screams and moans. Occasionally, there were clanging sounds and strange laughter. These sounds brought Emma's final moments to life in Henrik's mind. The next day, they spoke with Emma's close friends at the University of Amsterdam. Among her friends was Lotte Vermeer, a 23-year-old fine arts student. She was Emma's closest friend and the person who spent the most time with her in her final days. "Emma was very different in the last few weeks," said Lotte, her eyes teary. "She was constantly working on a secret project. She wouldn't tell us the details, but she seemed very excited and scared at the same time." "Did she mention the Crimson Club to you?" asked Henrik. Lotte's face changed. "How did you find out about that club?" "Emma told me not to tell anyone, but, yes, she was going there." Lars leaned forward. "How did she get in?" "Not everyone can get into places like that. Emma had gained access through her artist identity. She went there to take pictures at first, but then, it was as if she was spellbound. "I've found real art," she said. "I'm seeing people in their most naked state," she said. Henrik thought about the terrible implication of Lotte's words. Emma hadn't just gone there to take pictures, she had become part of that group. And that had led to her death. "Did Emma talk to you the last night?" Henrik asked. "Yes, she called me. She sounded very scared." "I think I made a mistake, Lotte," she said. "They really are," and then the phone went dead. I haven't heard from Emma since that night. With the information Lotte provided, Henrik could reconstruct Emma's last night. The young woman had realized something was wrong at the Crimson Club and tried to escape. But it was too late. That evening, Henrik and his team decided to take a closer look at the warehouse. They had to sneak in and see what was going on inside. But this operation was very dangerous. If they got caught, they could share Emma's fate. At midnight, Henrik and Lars tried to enter from the back of the warehouse. On the stairs leading to the basement, strange smells rose: candle smoke, sweat, and other unidentifiable odors. Corridors lit by red candles stretched along the walls. Inside, what Henrik saw deeply shook him. A large hall was covered in red curtains. Old chairs and tables were arranged around the room. Various metal tools hung on the walls. In the center was a wooden platform. People of various ages sat in the corners of the hall. They were all dressed in black, their faces pale and their eyes vacant. Some had small cuts on their arms and faces, cuts similar to Emma's. Henrik was beginning to understand what kind of group this was. These people were voluntarily inflicting pain on themselves, drawing blood, and viewing it as a kind of art or way of life. While Emma was taking pictures of this world, she had become a part of it. However, Emma's death was different from this group's normal activities. She had not been killed willingly, but by force. Someone in this group had broken the rules of the game. Henrik and Lars continued to observe the room, trying not to attract attention. Around 2 o'clock, the leader of the group appeared. He was a tall, thin man in his 40s. His name was Matthijs van der Meer, and he was a well-known art collector in Amsterdam. But tonight, he was a completely different person. "Friends," Matthijs began, his voice strangely hypnotic. "Tonight we have a special ceremony. Our new member, Emma, has left us. But she understood true art. She discovered the beauty of pain." Henrik's blood ran cold. This man was presenting Emma's death as some kind of celebration. The other members of the group applauded as if this were normal. "Emma's last work was very valuable to us," Matthijs continued. "She showed us how a true artist should live. She understood the connection between pain, beauty, and death." Henrik couldn't listen any longer. This man could be responsible for Emma's death. But he needed more evidence to prove it. That night, after Henrik and Lars left the warehouse, they analyzed what they had seen. The Crimson Club was not a normal group of art lovers. It was a dangerous cult, and Emma had been a victim of this group. The next day, they began researching Matthijs van der Meer. He lived in a luxury apartment in Amsterdam, ran an art gallery, and was a well-known figure in the city. However, there were suspicious events in his past. A few years ago, a young artist had died under suspicious circumstances during an exhibition at his gallery. While Henrik examined Matthijs' file, he tried to understand how this man could have deceived Emma. The young woman was passionate about her art, and when someone as well-known as Matthijs offered to mentor her, she may not have been suspicious. But Emma had gradually begun to understand Matthijs' true intentions. What she had said to Lotte in her last phone call was proof of this. The words, "I think I made a mistake," showed that Emma had sensed the danger. In the afternoon, the autopsy report from Dr. Visser confirmed Henrik's suspicions. The cuts on Emma's body had been made by someone experienced. And the most important detail was the DNA samples found under Emma's fingernails. She had fought back. "You need to have this DNA analyzed," Dr. Visser told Henrik. Emma scratched her attacker in her final moments. "This could be our strongest piece of evidence." While waiting for the DNA analysis results, Henrik continued to examine Emma's last days in more detail. The young woman's phone records showed that she had spoken frequently with Matthijs in recent weeks. In addition, photos taken at the Crimson Club were also examined. Analysis of the photos revealed horrific details. Emma had photographed the group's rituals. There were scenes of people cutting their own bodies, bleeding themselves into a kind of trance. However, in the last photos, it was clear that Emma was no longer just an observer, she had become part of the group. The most disturbing photo showed Emma herself. She had a small cut on her arm, and her eyes were glowing strangely. This photo was taken just 3 days before her death. At that point, Emma had been manipulated by the group. While examining the photos, Henrik noticed a figure standing in the background. Matthijs van der Meer was standing right next to Emma and looking at her strangely. It was the gaze of a hunter looking at his prey. When the DNA analysis results came back, Henrik's suspicions were confirmed. The DNA found under Emma's fingernails belonged to Matthijs van der Meer. Now they had enough evidence to arrest him. However, they had to be very careful when arresting Matthijs. This man was not just a killer, he was also a dangerous individual with manipulative abilities that could influence others. Other members of the Crimson Club could also be under his protection. That evening, Henrik and his team decided to raid Matthijs' home. Living in a luxurious apartment, this man presented a normal image to the outside world, but they were about to discover just how many dark secrets he held. Matthijs' home was in one of Amsterdam's most beautiful neighborhoods. This old building by the canal reflected the city's rich history. Its narrow but long structure bore the hallmarks of typical Dutch architecture. Anyone looking in would assume a cultured and wealthy person lived there. As Henrik stood in front of the door, he tried to understand how someone living in such a place could commit such a brutal crime. The other houses in the neighborhood were equally well kept and respectable. This place seemed far removed from where murders were committed. But Henrik was an experienced police officer. He knew what could be hidden behind beautiful appearances. Now he wondered what they would find inside this elegant house. They would probably encounter things they never expected. When they arrived at the house early in the morning with a search warrant, Matthijs was not home. He had gone to the gallery and was continuing his normal life as if nothing had happened. This made Henrik even more uncomfortable. A normal person would not be so relaxed while a police investigation was ongoing. When they entered the apartment, the sight that greeted Henrik was breathtaking. The walls were covered not only with works of art but also with strange photographs. These photographs depicted the rituals at the Crimson Club. Naked bodies, drops of blood, and faces in pain were displayed as if they were works of art. "This guy is completely insane," Lars muttered as he examined the photos. "These aren't art, they're the products of madness." Henrik examined the items on the large table in the middle of the living room. There were sharp knives, surgical instruments, and red liquids in glass bottles. A laboratory analysis would be needed to determine whether these liquids were blood or something else. On the bedroom wall hung a large photograph of Emma van der Berg. It was one of Emma's last photo shoots, but there was a disturbing detail. Emma's eyes had been strangely manipulated in the photo. Her pupils had been enlarged and given a reddish tint. It was as if Emma was being portrayed as a vampire. 0-inch Matthijs was obsessed with Emma, said Henrik, looking at the photo. This isn't just a murder, it's the result of an obsession. When they went down to the basement of the apartment, the real horror began. Can you imagine the horrific evidence Henrik will find in this house? Don't forget to like the video, because what comes next is even more suspenseful. The basement was completely painted red. Metal chains hung from the ceiling, and various torture devices were hung on the walls. In the middle was a metal table, and on this table were traces of attempts to clean up bloodstains. This room was where Emma spent her last moments. Henrik could feel it. The heaviness in the air, the coldness of the walls, and the shadows in the corners still held the pain the young woman had endured. The forensic team began examining every corner of the room. Bloodstains, fingerprint samples, and DNA evidence were collected. But the most disturbing find was a small video camera hidden under the table. There could be recordings on this camera, Dr. Visser said to Henrik. Emma's final moments may have been recorded. Henrik felt sick to his stomach. Matthijs had not only killed Emma, but he had also recorded her suffering. This was psychological disturbance at its most extreme. When the video recordings were examined, Emma's final hours were revealed in horrific detail. The young woman had been tied to that metal table, and Matthijs had slowly tortured her to death. Emma was crying, begging, and trying to escape in her final moments. "I am an artist, Emma," Matthijs said in the video, a strange calmness in his voice. "You are an artist too. Together we will create the most beautiful work of art. Pain is the purest form of art." Emma's screams pierced Henrik's soul. The young woman had fought until her last breath. And Matthijs had enjoyed watching her struggle. With the video evidence, there was now enough proof to arrest Matthijs van der Meer. But Henrik wanted to investigate this man's other activities at the Crimson Club. Emma might not have been the only victim. In the afternoon, they arrested Matthijs at his gallery. Even as he was being arrested, the man was strangely calm. It was as if he had known this would happen. "Commissioner Van Dyke," said Matthijs as the handcuffs were put on him. "Emma's death was not a tragedy, it was a masterpiece. You are too ordinary to understand that." Henrik did not respond to Matthijs' words. This man's mental state was too complex to be handled with normal police procedures. After being taken to the police station, Matthijs' interrogation began. Henrik and Lars had decided to be very careful in this conversation. Matthijs was not only manipulative, but also extremely intelligent. "What do you want me to tell you about Emma?" Matthijs asked, smiling. "How did you meet Emma?" Henrik began. "Emma came to my gallery about 3 months ago. She wanted to see my photographs. She was a very talented girl, but she was missing something. She hadn't yet understood real art." "What is real art, in your opinion?" Matthijs' eyes lit up. "Real art is pushing boundaries. It's discovering things society doesn't accept. Pain, death, blood, these are humanity's most raw emotions. They are the purest forms of art." Henrik understood how twisted this man's mind was. Matthijs had completely detached himself from normal moral values. He even saw Emma's death as a work of art. "Did you take Emma to the Crimson Club?" Emma was curious. "I just showed her the way. That group is a very valuable experience for young artists. There, they could discover real emotions. But Emma tried to escape in the end, didn't she?" A brief tension flashed across Matthijs' face. Emma was very young and inexperienced. She didn't understand what great art required. "I tried to help her. By killing her? By immortalizing her. Emma is no longer just a human being, she is a work of art. My work." When Henrik heard these words, he felt his patience reaching its limit. But he needed to get more information out of Matthijs. There could be other victims at the Crimson Club. Who else was harmed at the Crimson Club besides Emma? Harmed? Matthijs laughed. No one was harmed there. Everyone came of their own free will. Only Emma was different. She was special. Henrik understood the depth of Matthijs' obsession with Emma. This man had not only killed her, he had made her the centerpiece of his twisted fantasy. The interrogation went on for hours, but Matthijs refused to give any more details. The man had confessed to his crime, but he did so without remorse. He was still trying to justify Emma's death. When Henrik returned home that night, he felt the weight of this case on his shoulders. Emma van der Berg was just a young woman, only 22 years old, and she had dreams. Her passion for art had led to her death. This was one of the most brutal murders Henrik had seen in his career. But the job wasn't done yet. The other members of the Crimson Club were still unknown and needed to be investigated. Emma's death had exposed the dangerous nature of this underground group. Who knows how many other young people had put themselves in danger under the influence of this group. The next morning, Henrik and his team began to identify the other members of the Crimson Club. Data obtained from Matthijs' phone and computer showed that the group was active not only in Amsterdam but also in different cities across the Netherlands. This group targeted young artists, luring them into their twisted world. Emma was just the latest example of many victims. Henrik knew he had to work harder to completely dismantle this network. But at least justice had been served for Emma van der Berg. Matthijs van der Meer would be held responsible for her death and would serve his sentence. But that wouldn't bring Emma back. The young woman's family would have to continue living with this loss. When Henrik looked at Emma's last photos again, he could see her creativity and passion. If only that passion hadn't dragged her into a dark world. If only she could have discovered true art without pain and death. But it was too late now. Emma's story had ended, and Henrik would continue the quest for justice on her behalf. The cold corridors of the Amsterdam courthouse were filled with people waiting for the Matthijs van der Meer trial to begin. It was the last days of November, and the city was covered in a thick layer of snow. The courthouse's Gothic architecture only intensified the gloomy atmosphere. The Emma van der Berg murder case had attracted intense media attention in the Netherlands. As Henrik van Dyke entered the courtroom, he knew that this case was not just a murder trial. It was a deep investigation into the dark side of society, crimes committed in the name of art, and how young people could be manipulated. Emma's family sat in the front rows of the courtroom. Her mother, Ingrid, had red eyes, while her father, Willem, stared ahead with a stony expression. Chief Prosecutor Helena Groot was one of the Netherlands' most experienced criminal law experts. 50 years old, with long grey hair and a sharp gaze, this woman had been successful in the most complex cases throughout her career. The Matthijs van der Meer case also held special meaning for her. This case was the most extreme example of the intertwining of art and violence in modern society. Your Honors, Prosecutor Groot began, breaking the silence in the courtroom. The defendant standing before you, Matthijs van der Meer, is not just a murderer. He is a dangerous manipulator who lures young, innocent people into his twisted world and kills them, all in the name of art. Defense attorney Marcus de Vries was one of Amsterdam's most expensive lawyers. In his early 60s, he was an experienced and cunning lawyer. He had adopted a highly controversial strategy to defend Matthijs. He would try to prove that his client was mentally ill. Your Honors, said attorney de Vries, my client Matthijs van der Meer is a man suffering from severe psychological disorders. He has lost the distinction between reality and fantasy. Emma van der Berg's death is a horrific tragedy, but it is not a premeditated murder, it is the result of mental illness. Henrik had expected this defense strategy. Matthijs' lawyer would try to get him a lighter sentence by portraying him as mentally ill. However, when Henrik examined the videos and evidence, he saw that Matthijs' every move was calculated and deliberate. Dr. Marloes Visser was called as the first witness. The forensic pathologist detailed Emma's autopsy results. The silence in the courtroom grew heavier as Dr. Visser spoke. We found a total of 47 cut marks on Emma van der Berg's body, said Dr. Visser, reading from the report in her hand. These cuts were made meticulously and systematically. None of them were fatal on their own, but together they caused slow blood loss. The victim suffered consciously for approximately 4 to 6 hours. Emma's mother, Ingrid, screamed when she heard this explanation and had to be escorted out of the room. Her father, Willem, stared at Matthijs with eyes full of rage. How were these cuts made? Asked Chief Prosecutor Groot. The cuts were made with medical precision. The defendant had detailed knowledge of human anatomy. He avoided vital organs, targeting only areas that would cause blood loss. This points to deliberate torture. The defense attorney objected to Dr. Visser. Doctor, this systematic approach could also indicate that the defendant is not of sound mind, couldn't it? A normal person cannot be so detailed and cold-blooded. On the contrary, Dr. Visser replied sharply. This shows that the defendant's every move was conscious and calculated. A mentally ill person cannot be this systematic. The second witness called was Jeroen Bakker, a former member of the Crimson Club. The 26-year-old young man provided shocking details about the group's inner workings. Matthijs was a kind of leader among us, said Jeroen, his voice trembling. He would talk to us about the beauty of pain, about death as art. At first, these were just philosophical conversations, but then, things changed. How did they change? Asked Chief Prosecutor Groot. Matthijs began to show special interest in the new girls. He would have private sessions with them. We didn't know exactly what happened in those sessions, but the girls were very different afterwards. Emma was one of them. Jeroen's statement revealed that Matthijs systematically targeted young women. Emma was not the only victim. She was just the last one. How was Emma in her final days? Asked the prosecutor. She was scared. She told me, Matthijs wants strange things from me. She was trying to escape, but Matthijs wouldn't let her go. He told her, "You are my creation." This statement made the atmosphere in the courtroom even more tense. Matthijs saw Emma as his property. This was the most dangerous dimension of his obsession. On the third day, Henrik van Dijk was called as a witness. The chief inspector recounted Emma's case chronologically. The young woman's introduction to the Crimson Club, her gradual descent into the group's influence, and the horrific events of her final night were laid out in detail. Emma van der Berg called her friend Lotte on her last night and said, "I think I made a mistake," said Henrik. This shows that she realized the danger but was now unable to escape. Henrik mentioned the video recordings from Matthijs' home. These recordings turned the atmosphere in the room icy cold. The fact that Emma's final moments had been recorded made everyone feel sick. In the video recordings, the defendant was extremely calm and calculated, Henrik continued. Emma was begging, crying, but Matthijs was watching with pleasure. This is proof not of mental illness, but of completely conscious violence. The defense attorney asked Henrik tough questions. "Commissioner, did my client undergo a psychological evaluation? Is there a mental health report?" "Yes, there is. Psychiatric experts determined that the defendant is mentally sound. He was diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, but that does not make him criminally incompetent." On the fourth day, the most critical witness came to court, psychology expert Professor Dr. Anita Johansson. This expert, who examined Matthijs, presented a detailed analysis of the defendant's mental state. Matthijs van der Meer is a classic case of antisocial personality disorder, said Professor Johansson. He has no capacity for empathy, takes pleasure in the suffering of others, and feels no guilt. However, this does not render him mentally incompetent. He knew what he was doing was wrong, he just didn't care. How would you assess the defendant's relationship with art? Asked Chief Prosecutor Groot. Matthijs used art to legitimize his own deviant behavior. This has nothing to do with real art. He was killing people purely for his own pleasure and hiding it behind the mask of art. This statement undermined Matthijs' defense strategy. It was no longer possible to portray him as mentally ill. On the fifth day, Matthijs himself testified. There was a deep silence in the courtroom. Everyone was eagerly awaiting the words that would come out of this killer's mouth. When Matthijs stood up next to his lawyer, he was strangely calm. It was as if the courtroom was a stage for him. "Your Honors," Matthijs said in a theatrical tone. "I am an artist. All my life, I have searched for true art. Together with Emma van der Berg, we discovered the purest emotions of humanity. Pain, fear, death, these are the sources of true art." There was a violent reaction from the courtroom. Emma's father Willem jumped to his feet. "You are a monster. You killed my daughter." After the judge calmed the courtroom, Matthijs continued, "Emma wanted this. She was also searching for true art. We shared this experience together." Prosecutor Groot stood up. "Emma begged, she cried. You held her captive by force and tortured her to death. What does this have to do with art? Matthijs smiled. Art has never been understood. Future generations will understand me. Do you think Matthijs' defense is valid? How will this case end? Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications to stay informed about these mysterious cases. These words completely poisoned the atmosphere in the courtroom. Emma's family and friends were in tears. Matthijs showed no remorse until the very end. On the sixth day, the final defenses were presented. Chief Prosecutor Helena Groot summarized the case. Matthijs van der Meer didn't just kill Emma van der Berg. He manipulated her for weeks, terrorized her, and finally tortured her to death in the most cruel way. This is a premeditated murder and deserves the most severe punishment. Defense attorney Marcus de Vries resorted to a last-ditch effort. My client is a sick man. He needs treatment, not punishment. But this defense had lost its credibility. The evidence was clear. Matthijs had deliberately killed Emma. On the seventh day, the judges announced their verdict. Chief Judge Elizabeth Hendrik spoke in the deep silence of the courtroom. Our court finds the defendant Matthijs van der Meer guilty of the premeditated murder of Emma van der Berg. He is also found guilty of unlawful detention, torture, and other crimes. The defendant is sentenced to life imprisonment. This sentence will be served without the possibility of parole after 30 years. When the verdict was announced, Emma's family seemed relieved. Justice had been served, but Emma would not return. Matthijs, however, reacted to the verdict with complete indifference. It was as if this too was a performance for him. As Henrik left the courtroom, he thought about what this case had taught him. Art and creativity were beautiful things, but in the wrong hands, they could become the most dangerous weapons. Emma van der Berg had lost her life because of her passion for art. But at least justice had been served. Matthijs van der Meer would spend the rest of his life in prison and would not be able to harm other young people. 3 months after Matthijs van der Meer's conviction, a new case opened at the Amsterdam Police Homicide Division. This time, however, it was not directly related to the murder of Emma van der Berg, or so it seemed. When Henrik van Dijk encountered this new case, he felt the ghosts of the past beginning to haunt him again. The first warning sign began with the disappearance of 20-year-old Fleur Jansen, who lived in the Bijlmermeer district of Amsterdam. The young woman was a sculpture student at the Amsterdam Academy of Fine Arts and had a creative spirit like Emma van der Berg. Fleur's family had come to the police station to report that their daughter had not been home for 3 days. As Henrik examined Fleur's file, the similarities to Emma's case disturbed him. Both young women were art students, were close in age, and had exhibited behavioral changes in their final days. But what was most concerning were the drawings found in Fleur's room. The drawings resembled the symbols of the Crimson Club. Blood droplets, chains, and dark figures. Fleur's notebook contained various addresses under the heading New Beginning. These addresses pointed to old buildings and abandoned places in different parts of Amsterdam. Could the Crimson Club still be active? Lars Dekker asked, looking at Fleur's photo. Henrik frowned. Matthijs is in prison, but the other members of the group are still out there. Maybe they're regrouping under a new leader. This thought deeply disturbed Henrik. After Emma's death, he had thought the Crimson Club had disbanded. But such groups could have much deeper roots. Matthijs could have been just the visible part. That night, as Henrik sat at home, his phone rang. The caller was Fleur's closest friend, San van Houten. The young woman sounded terrified. "Commissioner, I want to help you find Fleur," San said, her voice trembling. "But what I'm about to tell you is very frightening." "I'm listening," said Henrik, gripping the phone tightly. Fleur had been hanging out with some very strange people in recent months. A new art group had formed in Amsterdam. They call themselves the Phoenix Collective. Some of the remaining members of the Crimson Club meet there. Henrik's heart began to race. Phoenix, the mythological creature reborn from its ashes. This could be the rebirth of the Crimson Club. We thought the Emma case was closed, but now we have a new threat. How would you handle this situation? If you like these kinds of true crime stories, don't forget to share the video. Who's the leader of this group? Henrik asked. I don't know exactly, but Fleur mentioned that a woman was in charge. Her name was Isabella. Matthijs' ex-girlfriend, they say. Isabella. Henrik hadn't heard that name before, but they hadn't looked into Matthijs' past in detail. This woman could have slipped through the cracks during the Emma case. The next morning, Henrik and his team began researching the Phoenix Collective. A few people in Amsterdam's underground art scene had heard the name. The group held secret meetings, just like the Crimson Club, and tried to influence young artists. The Phoenix Collective's headquarters was in the basement of an old shipyard building in the Amsterdam Noord district. The building looked completely abandoned from the outside, but it was determined to be active at night. Just like the Crimson Club, only invited guests could enter. When Henrik learned that this new group had emerged after Emma's death, he realized it was no coincidence. The former members of the Crimson Club had gathered around a new leader and continued their activities. It wasn't difficult to identify Isabella van Moorsel. In her early 30s, she had graduated from the psychology department at the University of Amsterdam, but her academic career had ended due to scandals. A few years ago, she had been expelled from the university for allegedly trying to manipulate her students. Isabella's relationship with Matthijs van der Meer had gone unnoticed during the Emma case. The two had lived together several years ago but had separated due to Isabella's extreme behavior. After Matthijs' arrest, Isabella had secretly founded the Phoenix Collective and attempted to continue Matthijs' legacy. This woman could be even more dangerous than Matthijs, said Lars, reviewing Isabella's file. She has a background in psychology, is an expert in manipulation, and knows Matthijs' methods. Henrik knew they had to move fast to stop Isabella. Fleur Jansen was still missing, and with each passing day, the risk of her sharing Emma's fate grew. That evening, Henrik and his team staged a covert raid on the shipyard building. When they quietly infiltrated the building, the scene they encountered was even more terrifying than the one at the Crimson Club. Isabella had refined and perfected Matthijs' methods. In the basement, a large hall had become the headquarters of the Phoenix Collective. The walls were painted red and gold, and crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling. In the middle of the room was a large metal platform, and Fleur Jansen was tied to it. However, unlike Emma, Fleur was still alive. Isabella had slowly taken control of her, subjecting her to a kind of brainwashing. The young woman's eyes were vacant, as if she were under hypnosis. Isabella van Moorsel stood on the top step of the staircase. With her long black hair, pale skin, and sharp facial features, she resembled a character from a vampire movie. She held a shiny knife in her hand and slowly approached Fleur. Tonight, the Phoenix Collective's first creation will be born, Isabella said, her voice magical and hypnotic. Fleur will be more perfect than Matthijs' Emma. Because she wants her own death. Henrik was horrified when he heard these words. Isabella was preparing to kill Fleur in a more cruel way than Emma. And worse, she had convinced the young woman to do it. Stop! Police! Henrik shouted, drawing his gun as he entered the hall. Isabella wasn't surprised. It was as if she had been expecting this. Commissioner Van Dyke, she said with a smile. I've been waiting for you. Have you come to avenge Emma? Let Fleur go and surrender, Henrik said, pointing his gun at Isabella. Fleur doesn't want to be released, replied Isabella, stroking Fleur's hair. I taught her what true art is. She now craves pain. When Henrik looked into Fleur's eyes, he saw that the young woman was indeed conscious. Isabella had influenced her so much that Fleur genuinely wanted to die. This was much more complicated than the Emma case. Fleur, listen to me, said Henrik, addressing the young woman. You are an artist, a creator. Death is not art. Life is art. But there was no reaction in Fleur's eyes. Isabella's psychological manipulation had been too deep. Isabella pressed the knife against Fleur's neck. True art lives forever, Commissioner. Emma didn't die, she became a work of art. Fleur will too. Henrik understood that Isabella's madness was different from Matthijs. Matthijs killed for his own pleasure, out of loyalty. Isabella truly believed this was art. That made her even more dangerous. Final warning, Isabella. Drop the knife. Isabella laughed. If you kill me, you lose Fleur. If you try to catch me, I'll cut her. The choice is yours, Commissioner. Are you wondering how Henrik will make this critical decision? If you want to experience the suspense, keep watching the video until the end. This moment was the most critical moment of Henrik's career. One wrong move could cost Fleur her life. But releasing Isabella was also not an option. At that moment, Lars and the other police officers entered through the other doors of the hall. Realizing she was surrounded, Isabella panicked. Just as she raised the knife to attack Fleur, Henrik fired. The bullet hit Isabella in the shoulder. She fell to the ground screaming in pain, the knife flying from her hand. Fleur, meanwhile, remained motionless, as if still under hypnosis. Even lying on the ground, Isabella continued to laugh. It's too late, Commissioner. The Phoenix Collective isn't just me. It will continue in other cities, other countries. Matthijs' artistic vision will never die. Henrik felt sick when he heard these words. Emma's death and Fleur's rescue were just the beginning. This perverted art movement had begun to spread across Europe. Isabella was taken to the hospital, and Fleur underwent intensive psychological treatment. It would take months for the young woman to recover from Isabella's influence. But at least she was alive. The other members of the Phoenix Collective were also arrested. However, Henrik knew that Isabella's last words were not an empty threat. This underground movement would not be confined to Amsterdam. A week later, Henrik visited Emma van der Berg's grave and stood respectfully before the memory of the young woman. Emma's death had led to the emergence of a greater darkness. But thanks to her, many young lives had been saved. You were a true artist, Emma, Henrik murmured before the gravestone. Art is life, not death. You knew that. In the silence of the cemetery, Henrik thought about similar cases he would encounter in the future. The Phoenix Collective had been stopped, but such deviant movements could always be reborn. The mission would continue. Emma van der Berg's story had ended, justice had been served. But Henrik van Dyke's struggle would continue. In the dark streets of Amsterdam, dangers awaited young and innocent people. And Henrik would be there to protect them. As the snow fell heavier in Amsterdam, the city lights shone with hope. Life was stronger than death. Art was more beautiful than pain. And justice would continue to illuminate the darkness. The memory of Emma van der Berg would live on forever in the streets of Amsterdam. The young woman's passion for art and creativity was far more valuable than the dark forces that killed her. And Henrik would never forget that truth. This incident shows us once again that no crime remains hidden. To make sure you don't miss out on more mysterious and terrifying true stories like this, please subscribe to our channel, like our video, and don't forget to leave a comment. If you want to watch more mysterious and terrifying events, see you in our next videos.